about fuel and fuel metering systems on reciprocating engine aircraft. And first of all, if you're using a gravity feed system, the federal aviation regulations require that the flow rate for that gravity system be 150% of the takeoff fuel consumption of the engine. We want to make sure that engine's going to have plenty of fuel when it needs it, so the flow rate's got to be 150% of the takeoff fuel consumption of the engine. Now, if you're working with larger aircraft, twin-engine aircraft, you're going to have a fuel cross-feed system. And a smaller twin, the idea is if you lose one engine, you can cross-feed the remaining engine from the tank on the opposite side of the airplane. And the purpose of that is to maintain aircraft stability, so you don't get too much fuel left on one side of the aircraft. So the purpose of a fuel cross-feed system is to maintain aircraft stability. Now, talking about fuel lines are kept away from sources of heat because if they ruptured or had a problem, then you could really get fires going. And also, you want to avoid sharp bends and steep rises to reduce the possibility of vapor lock. Heat sources, sharp bends, steep rises can all produce vapor lock problems in the fuel lines. Now, you want to, if possible, physically separate the fuel lines from any electrical wiring or conduits. But if that's not possible, if that's impractical, in that case what you want to do is locate the fuel line below the wiring and clamp the line securely to the airframe structure. Now, in the fuel system, you've got to have a fuel strainer or filter. And that fuel strainer or filter has to be located between the tank outlet and the fuel metering device, and they want you to have it located. It should be located at the lowest point in the fuel system. So any contaminants and so on and water in the system will collect there and can be drained out of the system. Now let's talk about how we measure our fuel flow. A fuel flow meter measures fuel consumption of an internal combustion engine, and it measures it more accurately than a lot of other gauges that they're going to ask you about on the test. It measures it better than a BMEP indicator, a fuel pressure gauge, a fuel quantity gauge or indicator, or a fuel totalizer, at least the older type. BMEP stands for brake mean effective pressure, and that's an indicator that measures the pressure actually inside the cylinders, in case you weren't familiar with that abbreviation, which you will see on the test. But the FAA says that the best way to measure the fuel consumption on an internal combustion engine is by using a fuel flow meter. Now, in a fuel-injected, horizontally opposed engine, the fuel flow indication that you're getting here is basically fuel pressure. It's a fuel pressure drop across the fuel injection nozzles. That's not a particularly accurate way to measure the fuel flow, because since it's measuring pressure, if you've got a clogged nozzle, that's going to cause an increase in pressure in the system, and that will make the indicator show an increase in fuel flow, which is exactly the opposite of what's really happening, because if you have a clogged nozzle, there's actually a decrease in the flow, but the increase in pressure shows an increase on the instrument in the cockpit. So on a twin-engine aircraft with fuel-injected reciprocating engines, if you're looking at the fuel flow indicator and one indicator reads consistently higher than the other, and it does that at all engine operating configurations, the probable cause is that you've got one or more fuel nozzles clogged, because what's happening to you there is that the pressure is building up because of the clogged nozzles, and that's giving a higher fuel flow indication reading. Now, if you have a fuel line that starts to leak and you've got this kind of pressure drop fuel flow indicating system, it would cause an increase in the system fuel flow. You've got a leaking fuel line, you're actually going to have more fuel flow moving through the system. Leaking out, not into the engine, nonetheless more fuel flow. But the problem is that you now have, because of the leak, a loss of pressure at the nozzle. and less pressure at the nozzle, guess what is going to show up as how on the gauge? It's going to show up as a decrease in the fuel flow on the gauge, because that gauge, although it says fuel flow, is really measuring the pressure drop across the nozzle. Less pressure, less fuel flow shown. Now, on a lot of the newer aircraft, you've got a computerized fuel system. And a computerized fuel system shows you lots of information about the aircraft fuel. In addition to the fuel quantity information, a computerized fuel system with a totalizer indication will give you 3 additional pieces of information. It will give you fuel flow rate, fuel used since it was reset or since the initial startup, and the fuel time remaining at the current power setting. So these computerized fuel systems have a world of information about the fuel in the aircraft. Not just the quantity you've got, but how much you've used altogether and how much time is remaining at the current power setting set in. Now, as far as the fuel system is concerned, the EGT gauge is used primarily just to give temperature readings in order to obtain the best mixture settings for fuel efficiency. So we're not using the EGT to figure out what the fuel consumption is, just to get some temperature indications in order to get our best mixture for fuel efficiency. Now let's talk about fuel priming systems. There's a lot of aircraft, the 340 and so on, that have an electric primer on it. And when you have an electric primer, fuel pressure is built up usually by using the booster pump. But the FAA has another question on the test that looks like it's kind of a contradiction to that. And it's not quite, but it addresses an unusual situation as if it was usual. And it says the electrical priming systems usually obtain fuel from the engine-driven pump. Well, some systems do use fuel from the engine-driven pump area instead of from the boost pump. But in an electric primer system, fuel is not taken from the carburetor like it is in a hand priming system. And that's the point they're trying to get across in that particular question, that the electric priming system in that case is getting its fuel from the engine-driven pump, and it is not getting it, because it is an electric system, it's not getting it from the carburetor. Now let's assume that you've got a radial engine, and you're going to prime that radial engine. You've got a multi-point priming system on a 9-cylinder radial engine. And the question is, what cylinders will the priming lines be connected to? Okay, the priming lines will be connected to 5 of the 9 cylinders. Cylinders 1, 2, 3, 8, and 9. Okay, how do we know which cylinders it's going to be connected to? Well, only the cylinders from horizontal up are primed in order to prevent liquid lock or hydraulic lock from getting fuel down in the bottom cylinders. And on a radial engine, you start numbering with the top cylinder, and you go, as seen from the cockpit, you go clockwise around in the numbering system. So the top cylinder is 1, as seen from the cockpit, clockwise is 2, then 3, and then over on the other side you've got 8 and 9. Those are the cylinders from horizontal up, and those are the ones that are primed. Now, a fuel system very commonly will have boost pumps. The fuel boost pumps, the whole purpose of those boost pumps is to provide a positive flow of fuel to the engine pump, so that the engine pump always has fuel lined up behind it, and particularly used when you know that you might need a lot of power out of the engine on takeoff or landing. And so the fuel boost pumps are providing a positive flow of fuel to the engine pump. Now, in the fuel system, we sometimes have fuel transfer ejectors. And take a look in the back of your King course book, behind the FAA questions in Appendix 2 at Figure 7. And when you see Figure 7, you'll notice that at the top of that diagram of the fuel system, we've got a fuel transfer ejector, one on each side actually, and the purpose of that is to help transfer fuel from the main tank into the sump for the boost pump. So what it's doing is pulling in fuel from the main tank and moving it into the sump for the boost pump so that the boost pump has a good supply of fuel in order to be able to push it on to the engine-driven pump. Now, boost pumps very typically are a centrifugal type pump. And the characteristic of a centrifugal type boost pump is that it separates the air and vapor from the fuel. And that's a good thing, because what you want to do is before you shove that fuel along into the engine-driven pump, you want to get rid of any air or vapor that's in it. And a centrifugal pump will do that. But a centrifugal pump is not classified as a positive displacement pump. On the other hand, a rotary vane type pump like we have here is described as a positive displacement pump. And a rotary vane type pump is used as the engine-driven pump on most reciprocating engines. Now, let's take a look at the pump. And by the way, this whole schematic is the pump, just kind of blown apart to be able to see the parts a little bit better, and talk about what's happening here. Here's the fuel inlet. The fuel swirls around in the vapor chamber as it comes in, and that releases the vapor in the air to move to the top of the chamber. Then the fuel goes on through the fuel vanes, the pump vanes, and it's pumped out under pressure into the engine. Most of it, but not all of it. Some of it comes back around through the fuel pressure relief valve, which we'll talk about more in a minute. Some of it comes around and goes across the top of the vapor chamber, and with a Venturi-like effect, it pulls the air and the vapor out of that vapor chamber and returns it to the fuel tank. And we also have a bypass valve down here, which we're going to talk about more later on. Now, when you have an engine-driven vane-type fuel pump, a fuel pressure relief valve is required. You have to have it. What it does is it directs excess fuel back around to the inlet side of the fuel pump. Basically, what happens is that the fuel pump does put out a lot more fuel than the engine needs, than it's capable of handling. So as the pressure builds up, it will force that fuel pressure relief valve to open, and that will stabilize the pressure in the fuel system at the pressure that is desired. The fuel pressure then that is delivered by the engine-driven fuel pump is adjusted by adjusting the relief valve adjusting screw. By adjusting that, you adjust the pressure at which it will open, and that determines what fuel pressure you're going to have in the engine. Now, fuel pump relief valves that are designed to compensate for atmospheric pressure variations are called balanced type relief valves. And that's the purpose of the diaphragm in most vane-type fuel pumps in the relief valve, is to compensate for fuel pressures, to compensate the fuel pressures for any altitude changes that you have. Now, let's see what happens if this pressure relief valve is sticky. If that valve is sticky and it does not open when it should, what will happen is that the pump is putting out the fuel, putting out the pressure builds up, and then because the valve doesn't open, the pressure continues to build up on the engine side of that pump. So a sticky fuel pump relief valve will cause the fuel pressure to fluctuate, and when the throttle is advanced, the fuel pressure will exceed the upper limits. You put the throttle forward, the engine-driven pump is going to put out more fuel, and if the relief valve doesn't open when it should, if it sticks, the pressure will build up and it will exceed the limits. You also have in this system a bypass valve. And the purpose of this bypass valve down here is to prevent a damaged or inoperative pump from blocking the fuel flow of another pump in series with it. In case for any reason this rotary type vane pump is not working, it allows the fuel to bypass. So let's take a look at what this same system looks like when that bypass valve is open. Let's assume that the boost pump pressure is greater than the fuel pump pressure. You got boost pump pushing fuel in here, and that pressure is greater than the fuel pump pressure. What's going to happen is that the bypass valve will open, and it will allow fuel to flow and continue on into the aircraft engine. And that might happen, for instance, when the engine-driven pump is damaged or it's not working. The section, by the way, between the engine-driven pump and the carburetor, going on into the carburetor, is the section that is least susceptible to vapor lock in the system. Now, when you've got a float-type carburetor used with an engine-driven fuel pump like this, most likely you're going to have a fuel pressure that runs about 3.5 to 5 pounds, about 3.5 to 5 pounds of pressure in the system. Okay, let's talk about carburetors. First of all, we want to talk about a float-type carburetor, and the carburetors have 6 systems to them. To provide for various loads and different engine speeds, the carburetor has 6 systems, which are the main metering system, the idling system, the accelerating system, the mixture control system, idle cutoff, and the power enrichment, which is also called the economizer system. Each one of these has a definite function, which we're going to be talking about, and they can act alone, or they may be acting with one or more of the others. So the main metering system in the carburetor supplies fuel to the engine at all speeds above idling. This is our diagram of the float-type carburetor, and the main metering system, which is the main engine jet here with some airflow and so on that we're going to be talking about, supplies fuel to the engine at all speeds above idling. We have a separate system that takes care of the fuel requirement at idling. And the fuel that's discharged by the system from the discharge nozzle here is determined by the drop in pressure in the venturi throat. Here's the venturi throat. Here's the throttle body, the throttle unit itself, the fuel discharge, the float chamber, the float, and so on. Now let's talk about that venturi system. The venturi, the carburetor venturi, measures and limits the amount of airflow delivered to the engine. So by going through the venturi system, it's measuring and limiting the amount of airflow. The pressure drop that you have in the carburetor venturi depends primarily on the velocity of the air. And let's take a look at how that works when we're working with a venturi. When air passes through a venturi, the velocity increases, the temperature decreases, and the pressure decreases. So as air is moving through, and this seems strange, and I always have, it seems odd that it happens, but when you have a narrow spot like the venturi is, the air speeds up to get through there, and the increased speed means that you have decreased pressure. Temperature also drops, but the increased speed gives you a decreased pressure. So the relationship between the pressure in the throat of a venturi and the velocity of the air going through is that the pressure is inversely, which means oppositely proportional to the velocity. The faster the velocity is, the less the pressure is. If the air in the venturi slows down, then you will have increased pressure. So if you increase the speed, you decrease the pressure. If you decrease the speed, then you're going to increase the pressure. It's inversely proportional to the velocity. Okay, so let's take a look at our carburetor again. If the volume of air that's going through the carburetor is reduced, less air velocity, what's going to happen to the pressure at the throat? When the velocity decreases, does the pressure increase or decrease? It increases because the pressure moves the opposite direction to what the velocity is doing. Now, during full power output of an unsupercharged engine that's got a float-type carburetor, the carburetor air scoop is going to have a higher pressure than either the engine side of the throttle valve up here, the venturi, or the intake manifold. The carburetor air scoop is going to have the highest pressure because you've got a venturi effect acting on the rest of it, and that's going to decrease the pressure as the air speeds up through these narrowed passageways. Okay, let's talk some more about the throttle valve. This is the throttle valve right here, located, by the way, in the throttle body. Get some terminology down here. The throttle valve is located after the main discharge nozzle. Here's the main discharge nozzle, and the air is going this way. And it is located between the venturi and the engine. Here's the venturi, which is the narrow part of the throttle body, and the engine is up here on the other side. The throttle valve is what controls the volume of the fuel-air mixture to the cylinders. The more open that throttle valve is, the more air and fuel mixture can get into the cylinders. When you close it, very little can get in. So the throttle valve is what controls the volume of the fuel-air mixture to the cylinders. Okay, let's take a look at the float chamber over here. The fuel level in the float chamber, if it's properly adjusted, will be slightly lower than the discharge nozzle outlet. Here's the outlet on the discharge nozzle, and the fuel level needs to be slightly lower. Otherwise, gravity is going to force the fuel out, and it will be discharging out of that nozzle all the time, and you don't want that to happen. What happens is the airflow going through here pulls the fuel the last little bit out of the discharge nozzle, assuming that it's properly adjusted, that the float's properly adjusted, and that the fuel level is just a little bit below that outlet on the discharge nozzle. Now, to determine the proper level, the proper float level in a float-type carburetor, what you do is you measure from the top of the fuel in the float chamber to the parting surface of the carburetor. The parting surface is where you take it apart. So from the top of the fuel in the float chamber to the parting surface where you take the carburetor apart. You do not want to measure the level at the edge of the float chamber, because at the edge of the float chamber, the fuel will tend to adhere to the wall and it actually cup and be a little bit higher than it is out in the middle of the float chamber. Now, to adjust the level on a float-type carburetor, what you do is you add or remove shims from the needle valve seat over here. What's happening is as this float goes up and down in the float chamber, it moves this needle valve up and down and allows fuel into the float chamber. And so what you do is you add or remove shims under the seat for this needle valve so that it makes contact at different times depending on how you need to adjust that level. If a float-type carburetor becomes flooded, the reason most probably is caused by a leaking needle valve and seat assembly, and that simply means that fuel is leaking through that needle valve and seat assembly all the time, even when the float tells it that it ought to be closed because it has all the fuel in there that it needs to have. If it's leaking fuel from the discharge nozzle, what that means is that the fuel is too high in the float chamber, which means that it's leaking in through that needle valve assembly probably. And what you need to do is replace the needle valve and the seat. Now, you can see that if you had a punctured float in a float-type carburetor like this, it's going to cause the fuel level to rise, because if you have that float punctured, it's going to get fuel inside it, and the float is going to get heavy and sink, and it's going to pull the needle valve up, and it's going to allow more fuel into there. So a punctured float causes the fuel level to rise, and if the fuel level rises, that's going to force more fuel out into the discharge nozzle, and that's going to enrich the mixture. So a punctured float will tend to enrich the fuel-air mixture. Now, the main metering jet over here actually functions as a metering jet at all RPMs above idle range. The fuel metering force, by the way, of a float-type carburetor in normal operating range is the difference between the pressure acting on the discharge nozzle, which is located here in the venturi, and the pressure acting on the fuel in the float chamber. What you've got is the discharge nozzle sticking right into the venturi. As the air goes through the venturi, it speeds up, the pressure decreases, and that decrease in pressure starts pulling on the fuel. Now, the float chamber is vented pretty much to atmospheric pressure. So the atmospheric pressure is going to have more pressure here than the discharge nozzle has got, because the discharge nozzle is in a low pressure area, and that tends to pull and push the fuel from the float chamber out through the discharge nozzle. So it's the difference between the pressure acting on the discharge nozzle in the venturi and the pressure acting on the fuel in the float chamber that provides the fuel metering force. Now, in that main discharge nozzle, you also have an air bleed, and on this diagram, here it is coming in from over on the right side. It's pulling air in from a very calm, a very protected area, pulling it in and mixing it in with the fuel. One of the purposes of an air bleed in a float-type carburetor like this is to decrease the fuel density and to destroy the surface tension of the fuel so that it will vaporize better. And that leads to the next question they're going to ask you, which is one of the things that that air bleed or metering orifice helps to accomplish. What it accomplishes is better fuel vaporization and control of the fuel discharge in the carburetor, especially when you're operating at lower engine speeds. Now, you might sometimes have incomplete fuel vaporization. If the fuel is not vaporizing properly, what will happen is that the engine will run lean even if you have the normal amount of fuel present, because it's not properly vaporized and it's not going to burn with a proper mixture. Now, what happens if the main air bleed on the float-type carburetor becomes clogged? If the main air bleed becomes clogged, the engine will run rich at rated power, because what's happening is you're not mixing any of the air in with that fuel, and you're going to have a lot of fuel, not much air, and the engine is going to run rich if that happens. Now let's talk about the idling system, because it's a separate system as far as the carburetor is concerned. The idling system is necessary because most metering systems are very unreliable at very low engine speeds. At low speeds, the throttle in the carburetor is nearly closed. The velocity of air through the venturi, therefore, is low, and there's very little drop in pressure. So the differential pressure when you're idling is not enough to operate the main metering system. In a conventional idling system, what happens is that fuel is taken from the fuel passage for the main discharge nozzle. That means the fuel is coming across like this. This is the idling system that we've got kind of a blow up on. And idle air bleed is taken from a chamber away from the venturi suction. So what happens then is the quantity of fuel that is flowing through the idle discharge nozzle is dependent upon the position of the throttle valve, because where the discharge nozzle is located is right behind the throttle valve. And if the throttle valve is mostly closed, what that idle discharge nozzle is exposed to is the engine suction, the piston suction, which is a low pressure area. Okay, so to recap this, you've got the idle discharge nozzle, you've got a fuel line coming up from the discharge nozzle, the main discharge nozzle, you've got an air bleed coming in basically from atmospheric pressure because it's not in the venturi, it's a chamber behind it. And you've got, when the throttle is mostly closed, you've got a low pressure area created by piston suction, which the discharge nozzle is exposed to, and the suction from the pistons pulls both fuel and air out through that idle mixture, out through the idle discharge nozzle. Okay. A float-type carburetor has to supply a rich mixture during idle because at idling speeds, the engine might not have enough airflow around the cylinders to provide proper cooling. So when the engine is idling, the mixture needs to be richer simply for cooling purposes than it needs to be in order simply to run. Now, as you can see, the carburetor venturi does not regulate the idle system. The venturi effect here, the suction from that, is not what's regulating the idle system. What's regulating it instead is the low pressure between the edges of the throttle valve and the throttle body, and the low pressure is pulling the fuel from the idle passage, from the idle discharge nozzle. Now, the engine will not idle if the idling jet becomes clogged. This idling jet right here is where the fuel comes from when the engine is idling, and if that jet is clogged, the engine simply will not idle properly. And again, the purpose of the air bleed in the idling jet, just like it was in the main jet, is to help in emulsifying the fuel at idle speed. In other words, breaking the fuel up into smaller droplets in order for it to be able to vaporize properly. Now, if you use a less than normal throttle opening during starting, then you're going to have a rich mixture, because if you start with the throttle completely closed, what's going to happen is you're going to have the idle mixture system, the idling system activated, and you're going to have a rich mixture because of that, because it's activated when the throttle is almost closed. So you want to use a normal throttle opening during starting in order to avoid getting too rich of a mixture. Now, if for some reason the idle mixture is excessively rich or excessively lean, what you'll end up with in the engine is incomplete combustion. And that's not a good thing, and that means that you're going to have to do some adjustment to adjust the idle. Now, if you're going to adjust the engine idle speed and mixture setting, you have to do it with the engine warmed up and operating. You want the engine at its normal operating temperatures. During idle mixture adjustments, the best indication that the correct mixture has been achieved is changes in RPM or manifold pressure. The changes in RPM or manifold pressure are what tell you if you've got the mixture set correctly. For instance, an indication that optimum idle mixture has been obtained occurs if the mixture control is moved to the idle cutoff position and the manifold pressure decreases slightly before it increases to ambient as the engine quits firing. Also, the RPM will increase 10 to 50 RPM before the engine stops. And those two indications, the manifold pressure decreasing slightly and the RPM increasing 10 to 50 RPM, tell you that the optimum idle mixture has been obtained. So the FAA will say to you, you're checking the idle mixture on a carburetor. The engine should be idling normally. Pull the mixture control towards the idle cutoff position, and what tells you that you have a correct idling mixture? Well, when you put the mixture in the cutoff position, your correct idling mixture is indicated because you have an increase of how many RPM? 10 to 50 RPM before it starts decreasing with the engine shut down. Now, the way you make the idle speed adjustments on a float-type carburetor is an adjustable throttle stop or linkage. Now, let's talk about the accelerating pump. If you've got an aircraft that's got some rapid power demands being made on it, you start accelerating, put the throttle in to accelerate the engine, you want to make sure during that increase in engine power that you do have adequate fuel flow. So during sudden acceleration, the problem you've got is that the increase in the airflow in the carburetor is so rapid that there's a little bit of time lag before the increase in fuel keeps the correct mixture in the new airflow. So the accelerating system provides extra fuel when you make a sudden acceleration on the engine, and by providing that extra fuel, it prevents a temporary leaning out of the mixture, and it gives you smooth acceleration. So if you take a look at our float-type carburetor schematic, what you find is that the accelerator pump is located right here. It's basically a piston that is activated when you put the throttle forward, and that piston, when it moves rapidly, as it does when you make a rapid throttle movement, will shove the fuel out in front of it, and it will momentarily enrich in the mixture. That piston, when you put the throttle forward very slowly, that piston will move slowly and the fuel will just kind of ooze by it and fill in behind it. But if you move the throttle rapidly, then that piston just pushes the fuel out in front of it, and that way it prevents the carburetor from leaning out and makes sure that you have appropriate fuel delivery when the engine is accelerating rapidly. So when the throttle is advanced, if an engine that's equipped with a float-type carburetor backfires or misses, a likely cause of that is that the accelerating pump is not operating properly. Now, let's talk about the ratio of fuel to air. First of all, the weight of air. 100 parts of dry air will weigh more than any mixture of air and water vapor. We got a lot of water vapor in this picture, a lot of humidity there, but dry air weighs more than air that has water vapor in it, because water vapor is less dense than air. So if the FAA asks you on the test, they give you various combinations of air and water vapor and ask you which one's going to weigh more. Always 100% dry air is going to weigh more than air that's got a lot of water vapor in it. Now, because of that, engine power will be decreased regardless of what the altitude is if the humidity is increased, because basically an engine uses air by weight as opposed to volume, and the humidity, the water vapor, is less dense than air, and therefore the power of the engine is going to be decreased. Now, if they say to you that you have a fuel-air mixture ratio of 11 to 1, what that means is that you've got 1 part fuel to 11 parts air. And the fact that it said a fuel-air mixture of 11 to 1 doesn't make any difference. Still, it's a 1 part fuel to 11 parts air. You've always got more air than you do fuel. You've always got more air than you do fuel. So it doesn't matter whether they say fuel-air mixture or air-fuel mixture. The bigger number is going to be how much air there is relative to the fuel. Now, when do you get maximum power? Maximum power is considered to be developed in a reciprocating engine when you have an air-fuel mixture of 12 to 1. An air-fuel mixture of 12 to 1 should give you maximum power. Now, the mixture ratio, which does give you best power, is richer than the mixture ratio that's going to give you maximum economy, in part because what you're going to need is you're going to need more fuel on that best power mixture to provide engine cooling, because you are going for a lot of power, which produces heat. Now, let's talk about an unsupercharged engine that's running at full throttle at sea level, and what is the manifold pressure going to look like? Well, the manifold pressure will be less than sea level pressure because of the fact that you've got a drop in pressure in the intake manifold. You just simply have a slight difference in the pressure. It's going to be a little bit lower than the ambient pressure is. Now, an unsupercharged engine at altitude, assuming that you're operating with the same RPM, is going to lose power due to the reduced density of the air that's drawn into the cylinders, because at altitude, the air, as we've said, is less dense. That's the purpose of the mixture control and the mixture control system. The purpose of the mixture control is the mixture control system determines the ratio of fuel to air in the mixture. And the pilot can select this on the manual mixture control system. Using the red knob here, you can select manually what mixture ratio you want. The function of an altitude mixture control basically is described as the device that regulates the richness, the ratio of the fuel-air charge that is entering the engine. Now, the reason that a carburetor is equipped with a mixture control is to prevent the mixture from becoming too rich as you go up to higher and higher altitudes. Because if you do not have an automatic mixture control, and we'll talk about an automatic mixture control later on, as you go to higher altitude, the mixture is going to be enriched, and the reason for that is because the density of the air is less. The density of the air is less. And by the way, that also applies with temperature. As the temperature increases, the fuel-air mixture will also become richer. If the airplane does not have an automatic mixture control, if it doesn't have a carburetor that compensates for altitude and temperature variations. Now let's assume that when the engine is idling, you're having a problem, and the problem that you're having is the mixture is too rich for some reason to allow the engine to idle. What kind of thing, the FAA will ask you, could cause that? Well, one of the things that could cause that is an open primer line. If the pilot has simply left the primer open, or there's some other mechanical problem that leaves an open primer line, that could cause the mixture to be too rich to allow the engine to idle properly. What would not cause it is a rich mixture setting, because at idle the fuel is not being metered by the normal mixture system. And it would not be a leak in the intake manifold, because a leak in the intake manifold could make it either rich or lean. If the mixture's too rich to allow the engine to idle, one prime candidate, one prime suspect would be an open primer line. Now let's assume that you are leaning the engine manually. If you get the mixture leaner than a mixture of, and they describe it this way as 0.060, a mixture leaner than 0.060 is going to result in the highest engine temperature, all other factors being constant. What you have, if you have a mixture ratio of 0.060, is you have approximately a 17-to-1 ratio, approximately a 17-to-1 ratio. And remember, we said about 12-to-1 is going to give you best power. So 17-to-1, 17 parts air to 1 part of fuel is getting to be pretty lean. That equates to 0.06, and that is going to give you the highest engine temperatures if all other factors are kept constant. Now, if you run with an excessively lean mixture, one of the things that you can have is backfiring through the carburetor. Backfiring through the carburetor generally results from using an excessively lean mixture, and it can also, by the way, cause an increase in the cylinder head temperatures. What happens when you are running at slow speeds, not particularly high power, is that if the mixture is too lean, there will be unused oxygen in that air, and essentially the fuel will burn too slowly, and the fuel-air mixture, the combustion, will not have finished by the time the intake valve opens again, and it will ignite the charge that's coming in the intake port, and it will backfire through the carburetor. So a lean mixture is most likely going to cause an engine to backfire through the induction system when you're operating at low RPM. If you're operating lean and at low RPM, what you probably get is a backfire, because with low RPM you don't have a lot of pressures inside the cylinders. But suppose you're operating at high RPM and you're running with a lean mixture, or maybe you're using fuel with too low an octane. What can you get in that case? In that case, you can get detonation. Detonation is caused by a number of things, one of them being running lean, the other being using fuel with too low an octane rating. But the reason you get detonation in this case, as opposed to a backfire through the carburetor, is because you're operating at high power settings. The high power settings create a lot of pressure inside the cylinder, and what happens there is that the fuel-air mixture just explodes due to the compression in part, and so it's like a fist slamming down on the piston, and you've got detonation going on in the cylinder. And detonation causes high cylinder head temperatures because the mixture here basically is burning too fast. The pressure in the cylinder is making it basically explode. Now, what kind of conditions will contribute to a tendency to detonate? Well, some conditions that will give you an increased tendency to detonate are high manifold pressure, a high intake air temperature, really hot days, or an overheated engine. Now let's talk about pre-ignition. Pre-ignition, unlike detonation, occurs basically when you have a hot spot and the fuel-air mixture in the cylinder fires too soon. So pre-ignition occurs when an area of the combustion chamber becomes incandescent and ignites that fuel-air mixture in advance of the normal timed ignition. That's a description of pre-ignition, not a description of detonation. And pre-ignition is not caused by improper ignition timing. It's caused by those incandescent spots inside the cylinder. Now let's take a look at our carburetor again. And let's talk about the back suction mixture control. One of the ways of controlling the mixture in a float type carburetor is by using a back suction type mixture control. And the purpose of it is to adjust the mixture by regulating the pressure on the fuel in the float chamber. We said earlier that basically what is forcing the fuel out through the main discharge nozzle is that there's a low pressure around the discharge nozzle because of the venturi, and there is more or less atmospheric pressure in the float chamber. And what the mixture control is doing here is venting and varying the pressure in here that's acting on the fuel in the float chamber. So the mixture control here is sometimes venting it completely to atmospheric pressure, and sometimes it is venting it over into the venturi area of the carburetor. And between those, by the mixture adjustment, you are adjusting basically the pressure, the air pressure in the float chamber, and that adjusts how much fuel is going to be pulled out of the main discharge nozzle. Now, on the idle cutoff system, the idle cutoff system allows the fuel flow, when you pull the mixture back to idle cutoff, to be shut off so that the engine can be stopped. And it's incorporated into the manual mixture control system. So when you pull your manual mixture control all the way back, you've activated the idle cutoff system. And the way it's accomplished on a carburetor with a back suction mixture control is by introducing low pressure air into the float chamber. And there's a line here that goes down to the throttle body, but on the engine side of the throttle valve, and what it's then reading is piston suction, so that you've got a strong low pressure area here. And when the mixture control is pulled to idle cutoff, this line with piston suction is opened into the float chamber, and what that means is that you now have a negative pressure area in the float chamber, and that prevents the fuel from flowing out the discharge nozzle. So what you're doing is introducing low pressure intake manifold or piston suction air into that float chamber to give it a negative pressure and prevent the fuel from flowing out the discharge nozzle. Now let's talk about the power enrichment system. The purpose of the power enrichment system is when you're operating at full power, you want to have the fuel more rich, basically in order to be able to keep the engine properly cool. At cruise speeds, you want to have a relatively lean mixture for economy reasons. You don't want to pump a lot of fuel through the engine if it doesn't really need it. But at high power output, the mixture is, part of what it's doing is cooling the engine. So the power enrichment system automatically brings about the necessary change that you need in the fuel-air ratio. Now the mixture that's used at rated power is richer than the mixture used in normal cruise, but it is still leaner than the idle mixture is. For example, take a look in Appendix 2 at Figure 6, and in Figure 6 we've got 4 graphs, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and the FAA will ask you which curve most nearly represents an aircraft engine's fuel-air ratio throughout the entire operating range. And the curve that shows that is shown in graph number 2, the upper right-hand graph. Now when you take a look at that graph, on the left side we've got the mixture, lean at the bottom and rich up at the top. Across the bottom we've got the power setting, the RPM from idle on the left to full throttle over on the right. And when you take a look at the curve, when the RPM is basically at idle, you have a very rich mixture setting because part of that fuel is being used for engine cooling. When you get into the normal cruising range, then you've got a very efficient, relatively lean mixture, but as you go up to full throttle again, the mixture gets richer as the power enrichment kicks in. So curve number 2 is going to be the graph for our full operating range. So float-type carburetors have power enrichments or economizers, and they're normally set, the carburetor is set for the leanest practical mixture delivery at cruising speed. And then what you do is enrich the mixture with the economizer setting at higher power settings. And the reason they call it an economizer system is because it allows you to economize on the fuel flow during normal cruise and then enrich it at higher power settings. And the way it's done in this particular carburetor is that there's a needle valve here which is attached to the throttle, and when the throttle is forward for your high power settings, it pulls that needle valve up, allows additional fuel to flow out of the float chamber and to flow out the discharge nozzle. So the economizer system increases the fuel-air ratio and provides fuel cooling at higher power settings. Let's talk now about carburetor icing. There's 3 general types of carburetor icing that are common to all aircraft, and that is fuel evaporation ice, throttle ice, and impact ice. And let's talk about those one at a time. First of all, let's talk about fuel evaporation ice. Fuel evaporation ice or refrigeration ice forms because you have a decrease in air temperature because of the evaporation of the fuel after the fuel enters the airstream. So it's the evaporation of the fuel that causes fuel evaporation ice because of the temperature drop. Now it occurs in those systems where fuel goes into the airstream upstream from the throttle valve, which is what we're showing right here. Refrigeration ice can be formed at temperatures as high as 100 degrees Fahrenheit. This kind of ice lowers manifold pressure, interferes with fuel flow, and can affect the mixture distribution. Now, the second kind of ice was throttle ice. With throttle ice, it forms on the rear side of the throttle valve, usually when the throttle is in a partially closed position. What happens is the rush of air across and around the throttle valve causes low pressure, and that creates a pressure differential across the throttle valve. That has a cooling effect, the pressure differential does, on the fuel-air charge. Throttle ice tends to accumulate around a restricted passage area there, and it seldom occurs at temperatures above 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Now the third type is impact ice. And impact ice you get basically from things hitting the carburetor and jamming in. It's formed from snow or sleet or subcooled liquid water or from water which impinges on surfaces that are at temperatures colder than 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Impact ice collects on or near a surface that changes the direction of the airflow. So whenever you have a bend in the intake system, that's where you can get the impact ice. It can build up on the carburetor elbow as well as the carburetor screen and the metering elements. Now the most dangerous impact ice is that ice which collects on the carburetor screen and causes a very rapid throttling of airflow and therefore of power. Now, in general, impact ice only forms when ice is forming on the leading edge of the aircraft structure. Let's take a look at our carburetor and talk about when we're going to have the most severe carburetor icing. First of all, it's going to be most severe at temperatures between 30 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And it will begin to accumulate before you get any other part of the airplane start icing. And that's because of the drop in temperature that you get going through the carburetor due to the increased speed of the air and also to the evaporation of the fuel. Now, how do you prevent carburetor icing? One method that's commonly used to prevent it is simply to preheat the carburetor intake air so that before the air goes into that carburetor intake, it's been preheated. And it's preheated by taking it from a warm area around the engine or around the exhaust system. Now, if you're starting an aircraft engine that is equipped with carburetor heat, The heat control should be placed in the cold position. You don't want it in the hot position when you're starting the engine. If you've got an airplane that's got a constant speed propeller, the way you can tell that you've got carburetor icing is that the RPM will be staying the same, but the manifold pressure is going to be dropping off. So with a constant speed propeller, the constant speed governor keeps the RPM constant, but the manifold pressure will be dropping off because of the icing that's forming in the carburetor. Now, if you apply carburetor heat, what that does is decrease the air density in the carburetor. So when you first put on carburetor heat, you're going to get a decrease in manifold pressure because of the decrease in the air density to the carburetor. But if you then get an increase in manifold pressure, what that means is that you did indeed have ice forming in the carburetor, and you're now getting an increase in manifold pressure because you've melted the ice off. You had ice in the carburetor, and the carburetor heat got rid of it and let the manifold pressure come back up. Now, when you have direct mechanical push-pull carburetor heat control linkages, you want to adjust them so that the stop on the diverter valve is contacted before the stop on the control lever in both the hot and the cold positions. Now, some aircraft that are equipped with carburetors also have an alternate air system. And the purpose of an alternate air system is that if the main air duct air filter becomes blocked or clogged with ice, the system will automatically open up a door and allow warm, unfiltered air from the engine compartment area to be drawn into the carburetor. Now, there is another way of eliminating carburetor icing, and that method is using alcohol spray in the induction duct. And a lot of big reciprocating engine aircraft, like the Constellation and others, use that method. So what they do is they spray alcohol into the induction duct, and where it's injected is into the airstream ahead of the carburetor, into the airstream ahead of the carburetor. Now, let's talk about pressure injection carburetors. Pressure injection carburetors are completely different from float-type carburetors. In this case, with a pressure injection carburetor, the only thing that the Venturi is doing is not pulling fuel out into the throttle body. The thing the Venturi is doing is to create pressure differentials which control fuel to the metering jet in proportion to the airflow to the engine. So in a pressure injection carburetor, we've got the following units. We've got a throttle body right in the center here. We've got the regulator unit, which is over on the right. We've got the fuel control unit, which we're not showing here. And we've got the automatic mixture control. The automatic mixture control is on the upper left here. And let's talk about each one of those. The throttle body basically contains the throttle valves, and it contains the main Venturi and the boost Venturi, and the impact tubes, which feed air into the regulator system. All the air that's going into the cylinders flows through this throttle body. And the airflow is measured by weight as it goes through so that you get the proper amount of fuel added to meet the engine demands under all conditions. Now, the regulator unit is a diaphragm-controlled unit. It's got 5 chambers in it. It also has a poppet valve assembly and a spring. Chamber A is regulated air inlet pressure. Where it's getting its air is from this impact tube here, which is basically vented to atmospheric pressure. Plus, it's got some other inputs to it from the automatic mixture control we'll talk about later. Chamber B is boost Venturi pressure. This lighter blue here is boost Venturi pressure, and it comes from, the air in there comes from the throat of this little boost Venturi. Chamber C contains metered fuel pressure. Chamber C has metered fuel pressure, which is coming from the fuel control unit. And Chamber D has got unmetered fuel pressure. It's the fuel pressure before it goes out to the fuel control unit. Chamber E has got the fuel coming in from the fuel pump, so it's got fuel pump pressure. Now you're going to need to know the chambers A, B, C, and D on the test. They do not give you a diagram to look at. You simply have to know which chamber does what because they will ask you questions regarding it. Chamber A is metered air pressure. Chamber B is unmetered. Chamber C is metered fuel pressure. Chamber D is unmetered fuel pressure. Okay, what happens then is this regulator unit regulates the fuel pressure to the inlet side of the metering jet in the fuel control unit. And the fuel control unit, which we're not showing here because they don't ask you those kind of detailed questions about it, has the metering jets and valves, and what it does is maintains the fuel pressure difference in the chambers C and D in order to measure the fuel that you're going to need. And it does it based on the air pressures in chambers A and B. Now, when you're starting an aircraft engine that is equipped with a pressure type carburetor, the way you start it is with the primer while the mixture control is positioned in the idle cutoff position. And then after the engine starts, you would move the mixture control forward. Let's take a look at our schematic again on that pressure carburetor, and let's talk about chamber C. Chamber C is the metered fuel pressure chamber, and that pressure is held constant throughout the entire engine operating range, and you need to remember that for the exam. Okay, now as the throttle of an engine that it does have a pressure injection carburetor like this is retarded, what happens is that the pressure differential between chambers A and B will decrease. Now, the way this normally works is that chamber A has the impact air pressure here. Chamber B has got the lower pressure because it's getting it from the boost venturi, and the whole purpose of that is to create a low pressure area. And what will happen is that if the engine is running at full throttle, this diaphragm will tend to move to the right because you've got lower and lower pressure on the right side of it. And as it moves to the right, by the way, it will push this poppet valve to the right, and that will open up this fuel valve and allow fuel to flow into chamber D and then to flow on through into the fuel control unit. So what's happening is that the air pressure is tending to open the poppet valve, and it's the differential between chamber A and B that opens that poppet valve. When the engine, it's open, the poppet valve is open more when the engine is running at higher power. But if you retard the throttle on this engine, what happens is that you have less airflow through the venturi, therefore you have less of a low pressure area, therefore you've got less difference between chambers A and B, and you don't tend to push the poppet valve to the right, and therefore it will move back to the left and it will reduce the fuel flow. And so the pressure differential between those chambers will be decreased when the engine throttle is decreased. And by the way, the engine is going to be lean at all power settings if this diaphragm between chambers A and B ruptures. And the reason for that is if that chamber ruptures, then you don't have any diaphragm pressure to push that poppet off to the right and let more fuel flow come in. The valve will tend to move to the left, and it will reduce the fuel flow, and it will make the engine run leaner. Now, when you have a pressure type carburetor like this, the fuel supply in the idling range, that's ensured by having a spring in the unmetered fuel chamber. And here's that spring, and what that spring does is when the engine is operating in the idling range, that spring will tend to hold the poppet valve open and allow fuel flow in so that you have the richer mixture that you need when the engine is idling. And it supplements the action of the normal metering forces. Okay, if at the top of this chamber that's got the fuel pressure coming in from the pump, before it goes into the unmetered chamber D, you've got a little vent float here, and if the vapor vent float loses its buoyancy, what will happen is the amount of fuel returning to the fuel tank from the carburetor will be increased. The vent air is going out the top, out this vent line here, and that float is controlling the amount that goes out, because as air builds up here, that float is going to drop and it's going to open a needle valve which allows the air to go out. But if that loses its buoyancy, then what will happen is the float will drop, and even though there's not much air up there, it's going to allow whatever air is there plus fuel to go on out, and you'll get both air and fuel going back the vent line back to the fuel supply tank. Now, let's talk about a diaphragm type accelerator pump. On a pressure type carburetor like this, you're going to have a diaphragm type accelerator pump. The increase in pressure, in manifold pressure, that occurs when you open the throttle valve is what actuates a single or double diaphragm accelerator pump. What you've got here is this is the fuel line that's coming in from the fuel control unit, and it's going through this area. It's also building up here in this little chamber where there's a diaphragm operated by a spring, and also we have an air line coming out to here. Now, when you open the throttle, what you get is an increase in air pressure here. Normally there's a bit of a suction and it's holding the spring back so the diaphragm stays flat back. But when you open the throttle, you get an increase in manifold pressure, and that releases the spring, releases the diaphragm. It pops forward and it pushes the fuel that's in all of this area here down and out through the discharge nozzle. So it's the increase in manifold pressure that happens because you open the throttle valve that discharges that diaphragm pump. And it works the same way whether it's a single diaphragm or a double diaphragm. It's discharged by that rise in pressure between the throttle valve, and by the way, the supercharger impeller, if you have one, is going to be down here. The rise in pressure between the throttle valve and the supercharger impeller. Now, there's no relationship in this carburetor between the accelerating pump and the enrichment valve, because they operate completely independently. In some carburetors they operate together, but in the pressure injection carburetor like this, they operate completely independently. No relation between the accelerator pump and the enrichment valve. Now, let's talk about the automatic mixture control. You're going to see that abbreviated AMC, and in our overall diagram of the pressure carburetor, here it is up here in the upper left. And what that is, the purpose of it is to compensate for changes in air density due to changes in temperature and changes in altitude. And by doing that, by compensating for that, it enables the right amount of fuel, the proper amount of fuel, to be delivered to the engine. Now, what does that unit look like? If you take a close-up look at it, what you find is there is a sealed bellows there, a calibrated needle, and a seat. You've got a needle here and a seat. The metallic bellows here is sealed at 28 inches of absolute pressure, and that bellows then, as the airplane goes to different altitudes, responds to changes in atmospheric temperature and pressure, and the expansion and contraction of that bellows moves this tapered needle down here, which changes the air pressure in those chambers A and B. So the automatic fuel flow metering mechanisms, that's what they're talking about here, the automatic mixture control, are actuated by the mass of air passing through the carburetor. Different than a float type carburetor, which works just with a volume of air, these automatic mixture controls work with the mass of air, the density of air also. And the way this automatic control works is it restricts the impact air passage into chamber A. So it restricts the airflow into chamber A, and that keeps the diaphragm, it keeps the pressure from building up in here, and it keeps the diaphragm therefore from moving to the right, and it keeps the poppet valve from opening as much. So it leans the mixture by having less air pressure in chamber A. Less air pressure in chamber A means that this poppet valve will be more closed, and that means a leaner mixture. It's simply causing the metering force, as they call this air force here, the metering force is going to be decreased. Now, if the bellows on the automatic mixture control should rupture, what's going to happen is that the engine will run richer at altitude, because the purpose of this control is to restrict the impact air in here and make it the carburetor leaner at altitude. And if that bellows ruptures and it can't do its job anymore, then the engine is going to run richer than it's designed to at altitude. If you have a defective automatic mixture control unit, and one of the ways that it can be defective is that it gets stuck in the high altitude position, that could cause a lean mixture and correspondingly high cylinder temperatures. Now, they don't tell you on the test specifically that the automatic mixture control is stuck in high altitude position. They simply say that you have a defective automatic mixture control, and that they want you to know that that could cause a lean mixture and high cylinder temperatures. Now let's talk about some items on carburetor maintenance. First of all, when a new carburetor is installed on an engine and the engine is warmed up to normal temperatures, what you want to do then is adjust first the idle mixture and then the idle speed. So you want to adjust the mixture first, and then you want to adjust the speed when you're adjusting the idle. Now, the proper throttle rigging on an airplane requires that the throttle stop on the carburetor be contacted before you get to the stop on the control in the cockpit. If you're putting thread lubricant on a tapered pipe plug in a carburetor float bowl, what you want to do is engage the first thread of the plug and then put a small amount of lubricant on the second thread and go ahead and screw the plug in. You want to make sure that you don't get the lubricant actually inside the carburetor. If you're changing a float-type carburetor from a 150 horsepower engine for use with a 180 horsepower engine, you're probably going to have to change the venturi along with the carburetor. If a float-type carburetor leaks fuel when the engine is stopped, a likely cause of that is that the float needle valve is worn or otherwise not seated properly. Now, when the engine is overhauled, the carburetor should be overhauled also. And who's the final authority for the details on how to do that? It's the manufacturer's recommendations. When you overhaul a carburetor, you want to be sure and follow the manufacturer's recommendations. Now, on some aircraft, like the Cessna 421, instead of having a float-type carburetor, the engines have a fuel injection system. The fuel injection system replaces the carburetor, and what the fuel injection system does is inject fuel either into the induction system or directly into the cylinder, depending on what type of fuel injection system it is. Now, there's a number of advantages of fuel injection. With fuel injection, you have a more even distribution of the fuel-air charge to the cylinders. You have better control of the fuel-air ratio. And you also eliminate the vaporization icing in the carburetor. A lot of advantages to fuel injection. Because you eliminate the vaporization icing in the carburetor, you don't have a carburetor, you don't need a carburetor air heater. With a fuel injection system, no carburetor air heater is required. Now, there are two basic types of fuel injection systems. You've got the direct type and you've got the continuous flow. Let's talk very briefly about the direct type. With direct fuel injection, what happens is the fuel is forced directly into the individual combustion chambers. It's forced in timed high-pressure spurts right into the combustion chambers. That is a complicated system, and it's difficult to maintain. So it's not used much anymore. What's used instead is a continuous flow fuel injection system. Now, with a continuous flow fuel injection system, what happens is the fuel is injected at each cylinder intake port. So instead of going directly into the combustion chamber, the fuel is injected at the cylinder intake ports instead. It's a simpler system, and so it's replaced the much more complex direct system. Now, when you have continuous cylinder fuel injection systems, what happens is that you have fuel always available at that intake port. The fuel is being discharged continuously, and it's being discharged during all 4 strokes of the engine. So if they say to you on the test, with a continuous cylinder fuel injection system, during which strokes do you have fuel? You have fuel discharged continuously during all the strokes of the engine. Now, there's a couple of different types of continuous flow fuel injection systems. And they're going to be asking you about the Teledyne Continental one as opposed to the RSA, the Precision Air Motive, or Bendix one. With the Continental system, for fuel metering, what they use is fuel pressure only for the fuel metering. They do not use a pressure drop with airflow. That's the RSA system. So when they ask you on the test for fuel metering in the Continental fuel injection system, what is used, the answer they're looking for is fuel pressure only for the fuel metering in the Continental system. Now, the Continental system also has an altitude compensating or aneroid valve. And the purpose of that altitude compensating or aneroid valve is to prevent an overly rich mixture during sudden acceleration of the engine. Now, the discharge nozzles in a fuel-injected reciprocating engine have different flow ranges, and they're identified to tell you what that flow range is, and they identify it by putting an identification letter stamped on one of the hexes of the nozzle body. It's not painted different colors, there's not tags on it, but the ID letter is stamped into one of the hexes of the nozzle body. Now, in that fuel discharge nozzle, you've got an air bleed or air bleed openings. Those air bleed openings help in proper fuel vaporization. You want to make sure the fuel is properly vaporized so that it will burn properly in the combustion chamber. Let's talk about backfiring for a minute. Backfiring is when the fuel-air mixture in the intake manifold or induction system ignites. And the reason that it ignites is because flame has lingered in the cylinder, due probably to an overly lean mixture, and then when the intake valve opens, or maybe the intake valve clearance is faulty, that flame moves into the induction port or into the induction system, and then you get the fuel-air mixture in that intake manifold system igniting. As opposed to backfiring, what afterfiring is the ignition of unburned charges of fuel that mix with air in the exhaust system. And one of the things the FAA is going to ask you is, what is least likely to occur if you've got a direct cylinder fuel injection system, backfiring or afterfiring? Well, backfiring is least likely to occur if you happen to have a direct cylinder fuel injection system because there's only air in the induction system. There isn't any fuel-air mixture in the induction system to ignite because, remember, in a direct fuel injection system, the fuel is injected directly into the cylinders themselves. So backfiring is much less likely to occur with a direct cylinder fuel injection system as opposed to, for instance, afterfiring or kickback. Now, the fuel systems of aircraft that are certificated in the standard classification have to include a positive means of shutting off the fuel to all the engines. It has to have fuel shut-off valves, and here's the cockpit control on that. The fuel shut-off valve itself, the valve itself, is usually located just aft of the firewall. Now, let's assume you're out flying your Corsair and you want to increase engine power, but at the same time you want to control detonation and pre-ignition. How could you do it? You could use water injection, and a water injection system will do exactly that. Increase the engine power, but at the same time control detonation and pre-ignition. Let's talk about turbine engines and turbine fuels. Now, the primary condition that allows microorganisms to grow in fuel is the presence of water. And that's one of the reasons, to prevent those microorganisms, that additives are added to jet fuel. Kerosene is the fuel we use for jet engines, and that's because it's got more heat energy per gallon than gasoline does, and also its high viscosity lubricates the fuel system components. Now, as far as filters are concerned, it's very important in a turbine engine to have very good filtration, and so typically a micron filter is used. Micron filters have the greatest filtering action compared to wire mesh or wafer screen or similar other filters. A micron filter has the greatest filtering action. Now let's talk about the fuel flow meters that you might use on a turbine engine aircraft. The fuel flow meter is usually a more complex system than the one that's used that we talked about in a reciprocating engine aircraft. In a turbine system, usually what you've got is an impeller that's driven at a constant speed by a special three-phase motor, and that motor, that impeller, directs the fuel to the turbine. Now the turbine deflects, it doesn't rotate, and it deflects based on both the volume of the fuel flow and also the density of the fuel. And the position of the turbine, how much it's deflected, because it doesn't rotate, it just deflects a certain amount based on that fuel information, is transmitted electrically to the fuel flow indicator and needle up in the cockpit of the aircraft. The fuel flow data that's sent from the motor-driven impeller and the turbine fuel flow transmitters, therefore, is a measure of fuel mass flow. Exact terminology you're going to see on the test. It's a measure of fuel mass flow. And the data is transmitted to the cockpit using the aircraft system electrical power. So if you don't have any power on the aircraft, you're not going to be getting any fuel flow information. Now, most of today's turbine engines use one or the other of a fuel control unit, either a hydromechanical or an electronic fuel control unit. Sometimes it seems like everything in the aircraft is an input to the turbine engine fuel control unit, including, it seems sometimes, the pilot relief tube. But there's two of them you're going to see specifically on the test that are inputs to the turbine engine fuel control unit, and that is the compressor inlet pressure and the compressor inlet temperature. One of the things that is not an input is the ambient humidity. That is not an input to the fuel control unit. Now, the burner pressure influences very strongly the operation of the automatic fuel control unit on a turbojet engine. The automatic fuel control unit does not have a mixture control position, and it's necessary to control the acceleration and the deceleration rates in turbine engines in order to prevent blowout or die out. Now, blowout is when the fire is too rich and the extra fuel basically blows it out. Die out is when the fire is too lean and it actually dies out from not enough fuel in the mixture. A lean die out, you need to know, may be the result of a weak fuel-to-air mixture along with normal airflow. In other words, the fuel-to-air mixture is weak or too lean. On a turbine engine, you can very often use alternate fuels. But when you do that, you have to check the fuel-specific gravity, and there is an adjustment for that. And if you're going to have the turbine engine performance checks be valid, you have to make the adjustment for fuel-specific gravity if the engine is going to be using an alternate fuel, an alternate grade of jet fuel, or if it's going to, for some reason, going to have to be using gasoline. Let's talk about electronic engine controls. One type of electronic engine control is a supervisory electronic engine control. The supervisory electronic engine control receives engine operating information, and what it does is it adjusts a standard hydromechanical fuel control unit, and the purpose of doing that is to get the most effective, the most efficient engine operation. But it's only supervising a standard hydromechanical fuel control unit. So in a supervisory EEC system, if there is a fault, if there's a problem in the electronic engine control system, and that fault would adversely affect engine operation, what happens? You immediately have a reversion to control by the hydromechanical fuel control unit. The engine won't be quite as efficient, but basically what happens is immediately it reverts to the normal control of the hydromechanical fuel control unit. Just kicks out the supervisory EEC. A full authority electronic engine control unit is a little bit different. A full authority electronic engine control system receives all of the necessary data for engine operation, and that unit develops the commands to various actuators to control engine parameters. The supervisory unit is basically controlling it during cruise, and engine start and shutdown is all done by the hydromechanical unit. With a full authority unit, that unit does everything for all of the different engine operations, including startup, shutdown, cruise, and so on. Now, part of the full authority electronic engine control is a system called active clearance control. And what the active clearance control does is in cruise, it runs air through the turbine case in order to cool it. The purpose is to cool the case and shrink it down a little bit so that there's a tighter fit, less gap between the turbine blades and the turbine case. And the whole idea behind that is a smaller gap there is going to give you more power and more efficiency out of the engine. You've got less wasted air than going through the hot section. So the purpose of the active clearance control is to ensure turbine blade to engine case clearances are kept to a minimum by controlling the case temperature. Now, if the fuel control unit has been replaced on a turbine engine, one of the things you're going to have to do is retrim the engine. And the primary purpose for trimming that engine fuel control unit is to make sure that the engine will deliver the maximum thrust output when it's desired. When you're trimming a turbine engine, what you're doing is adjusting the fuel control in order to set idle RPM and also to set the maximum speed or the maximum engine pressure ratio. Now, one of the things you have to do if you're going to trim the engine is know what the temperature is on site. The most acceptable way to get accurate on-site temperature is to hang a thermometer in the shade of the nose wheel well until the temperature reading stabilizes and then read it. The reading at the airport, the reading on the outside air temperature gauge, those are not going to be very accurate, so you want a thermometer in the shade of the nose wheel to get the most accurate on-site temperature. When you're trimming a turbine engine, again, for it to be most accurate, you want there to be no wind and you want there to be low moisture. If there is a wind, the aircraft should be faced into the wind when you're trimming an engine. The problem is that if you have very much wind velocity blowing into the intake of the engine, it's going to give you a false high compression reading and turbine discharge pressure reading, and subsequently the trim on the engine is going to be off. You'll have low trim. That's why you want ideally to have a no wind condition if you can. When you're trimming the engine, you also want to turn off all of the accessory bleed air. That's the correct way to do it, is turn off all of the accessory bleed air. Now, in order to stabilize the cams, the springs, the linkages when you're trimming the engine, The manufacturers recommend that you make all of the last trim adjustments be made in the increase direction in order to make sure that everything inside that fuel control unit is stabilized. Now, in the turbine engine combustion chambers, when you get actually into the combustion chambers, you find the fuel nozzles, and there are both simplex and duplex fuel nozzles. Now, the duplex fuel nozzle is what's used in most turbine engines because it provides for better atomization and also a uniform flow pattern on the fuel. Now, duplex fuel nozzles have a flow divider in them, and the purpose of it is that it creates primary and secondary fuel supplies. The primary fuel supply is used for starting and idling as well as higher power, and then the secondary fuel supply kicks in at higher power. Fuel pressure is what causes the fuel divider valve to open in that duplex fuel nozzle. Now, if you're looking at the airplane and you find hot spots on the tail cone, hot spots indicate that the combustion chamber of the jet engine isn't working properly. And hot spots in the combustion section are possible indicators that you have malfunctioning fuel nozzles in the combustion chamber. Now, sometimes on a turbine engine, you'll find a condition known as hot streaking. And hot streaking in turbine engines is caused by a partially clogged fuel nozzle, and the flame has gotten all the way back into the tail cone area. Now, leading into the fuel nozzle is the pressurization and dump valve. Actually, two valves, a pressurization valve and a dump valve. And the purpose of the pressurization and dump valve on turbojet engines is to allow fuel pressurization of the engine when it's starting, gives you the primary and secondary fuel flow, and also to dump the fuel pressure through the dump valve at engine shutdown. Now, on turbine engines that utilize a pressurization and dump valve, the dump portion of the valve drains the engine manifold lines, and the purpose of that is to prevent the fuel from boiling and to prevent subsequent deposits in the fuel lines, because you've got a lot of residual engine heat at engine shutdown. Now, what kind of positions are the pressurization valve and the dump valve going to be in when you're shutting down the engine? Well, on shutdown, the pressurization valve is going to be closed because you don't want the engine to run anymore. You don't want that fuel system to be pressurized. And the dump valve is going to be open on shutdown so it can drain that residual fuel out and prevent those buildups in the lines. And that's what you need to know about fuels and fuel metering systems.